Hi, folks. Travis here with Interaction Games, and we thought I've got a little bit of time right now, so I figured why not do something kind of like a live. Um, we obviously, our follower count currently today, as of 9th of January 2026, is low enough that if we went live, we probably wouldn't catch any of you online. So we figured we'll just do an off the cuff recording and just talk through some stuff as if it were live. So hopefully we'll get to a point where there'll be enough of you that want to hear what we have to say that we'll be able to do lives, and we really look forward to the opportunity of interacting with you in the chat as we're recording and streaming. So this video came about because I've been watching a lot of Matt Colville's Designing the Game series. It's a fantastic series. I love the way he articulates his thoughts about game design. And if you are even remotely interested in game design at all, you haven't watched his video series, you need to do that. Wait till this video is over, stick around with me, and then go check his stuff out because he's absolutely fantastic. But we thought we'd talk about just this process that we've gone through over the last, frankly, at this point, year and a half or so, back and forth with trying to figure out a way to balance out the tension between good dice rolling mechanics and speed of gameplay. We got Altered World from the original creators. We were part of the development. Seth and I were part of the development team back in the late 90s. We were playtesters back in the late 90s, and the game never really just came about. And so we licensed it from the original creators and have just been working on it for the last couple of years, trying to get it up to date with the expectations of modern TTRPG play, because it was very much a product of its time, and it was a reaction in many ways to the gameplay styles of the games that dominated back then. In some conversations with Mike, the original creator, he's talked about that, like, he would have this kind of off the wall idea and then immediately be told, oh, well, you can't do that in this game. And he was tired of hearing that all the time. And so he created Altered World. Our game is definitely on the crunchier side. Our rules system leans towards physics engine rather than fantasy engine. And the effect of that is that you end up with lots of conditional modifiers, that because of this condition that's going on, you end up having this modifier to your roll. We elected to use 2d10. There was some monetary impact on that. It was cheaper to have 2 dice than it was to have a whole handful. We were very fond of Shadowrun back in the day, and you can clearly see the influence on our game. But we didn't like this dice pool mechanic where you needed to have just like boatloads of dice and carry them around and whatever. And so we ended up using 2d10, and we wanted to be able to make it where your character sheet was the only place you needed to look to see if you were successful at an action. And so we had a fixed DC or success threshold of 20. And so the idea was that you were always trying to achieve 20 or higher on your roll on 2d10. And so as kind of a side to this, we also wanted to psychologically reduce the burden of doing the math. We realized that when you roll the dice and then you add a bunch of modifiers, there is this unspoken but very real psychological pressure to do that math quickly. And so what we've figured out is if you do the math in the front of the roll or before you throw the dice, what ends up with is you say, oh, okay, I know in order to be successful, I only need to roll this number. And you can then very quickly, once the dice are thrown, you can very quickly adjudicate whether or not that action was actually successful or not. Because you just say, I needed to roll a 5, I got a 10, that's above a 5, I succeed. And so that was our kind of design process from dice mechanics in the original game. And you had lots of different things that added or bonuses or penalties. And the idea is that because we do the math on the front, this is a little different from most games. Positive modifiers or additive modifiers are penalties, and negative modifiers or subtractive modifiers are bonuses, because the idea is that you're modifying the number that you need to roll rather than modifying the dice roll. And so what we found was when we started talking about when we got to a point with our current state where we started doing play testing at some conventions and whatever, we realized that all of this math is really cool when everybody at the table knows the game. I will tell you, as a game master, I would come out of a 4-hour one shot with smoke pouring out of my ears because I've been trying to carry the math for everyone at the table and all of my NPCs the whole game. Because you just, very reasonably can't expect people, even if you give them a list of the potential modifiers and how the dice work, you can't expect them to have that down pat. So you're having to carry that water for them. And so we would have these kinds of situations like this that led us to try and figure out, like, hey, what can we do to simplify this? And both from that perspective and from the perspective of, we know that there's going to be exactly 0 players that have never played any TTRPG, and they're going to come straight to Altered World, and that's all they're ever going to play. We acknowledge everybody's going to be coming to us from a prior background, probably with 5th edition D&D. And so what are they used to? They're used to, occasionally you have issues where you add or subtract modifiers to your dice roll. But by and large, they're looking at advantage and disadvantage. And so we thought that's part of the success of the system. It's a very clean and easy way to, very friendly way to affect dice rolls. And so we thought this would be a good option to try and take a look at what we could do with that. So we got this idea. We don't want to copy advantage or disadvantage, but we want that feel, and we want that in a way that reflects our game. And so what we did was we came up with what's called Edge and Hitch. We used those names because we felt like our game has a very far future science fiction narrative setting with fantasy elements. And so it's got kind of a cyberpunk feel in a lot of play. And so we thought that the idea of getting an edge on your roll, or saying that you were rolling with an edge, had a very on-brand kind of theme or feel to it. And we're both old enough that we had heard people say, oh, you got a hitch in your giddy up when you were limping or whatever. And so that was a word that felt right to us. And so we went with Edge and Hitch, and we didn't want to now go from, oh, you only need 2 dice to, oh, well, maybe you need 4 and you got to roll them twice or whatever. And we decided what would be kind of neat is if, instead of rolling 2 dice and that's what you got, or rolling 2 dice twice and taking the higher result, what if you rolled 3 and you took the 2 dice that gave you the best result? And we initially started with highest for Edge and lowest for Hitch, but then we realized the way our dice system works, you need to specify it's the best roll or the worst roll. Because when you use 2 dice, you introduce the possibility of rolling doubles. So in our system, if you roll doubles, your character immediately gains 1 point of experience And then you roll 1 additional die and add it to your total. So if you roll 2 3s and then 1 die would explode, you'd get a point of experience. And then you would turn around and you would roll 1 more and add it to those those 2 threes. And that would be, say you roll a 3, a 3, and then 7, then your total would be, what is that? 13. And so when you have doubles, what that means is that the highest 2 dice and the lowest 2 dice are not necessarily the best and the worst rolls, respectively. For example, if you rolled a 5 and you rolled, well, let's say you rolled a 3 and you're rolling with hitch, and you rolled 2 1s and a 2. So 1 1 2. You could interpret that and you could say, oh, well, that's a 2, but because it's double 1s, you're going to roll a 3rd die, or in this case, a 4th die, and you're going to add it to your total. So the lowest that can possibly be is a 4, because that dice that explodes, if it comes up with the same number, it explodes again. So, we said, okay, we want to make sure that it's the worst result, not necessarily the lowest that you're looking at. And the same with hitch. That the possibility of rolling doubles could generate situations where rolling or choosing to use 2 3s might be a better option than, say, an 8, right? So if you roll 2 3s and an 8, you have your average roll on that 3rd one is probably going to be a 12 total, or a 4.5 or 5.5. So you're probably going to end up with somewhere around a 12 or 13 on average roll, as opposed to taking the 11. And so when we rolled with hitch, what we wanted to do is we wanted to be consistent. We didn't want to have some areas where you added mathematical modifiers to your roll, and then you had other ones where you were rolling with edge and hitch. And so we had this imperative to try to find all of the areas where we were adding or subtracting modifiers to your ARB, and then replace those with edge and hitch. So when we started looking at what this does mathematically, we realized that what we were doing was we were condensing down the magnitude or the severity of the effect from penalties or bonuses. So instead of being able to get a +5 or a +6 or a -7 or whatever on your roll, you were kind of limited to edge or hitch, and that ended up being mathematically about a ±4 in most cases. And so then it was like, well, okay, we're artificially limiting the severity of penalties and bonuses. How do we reflect things that have really strong effects on your rolls? And so we said, well, maybe these things give multiple levels of edge or hitch. And so that led us down. One of the things we don't like about advantage, and then a lot of people don't like about advantage and disadvantage in 5e, is that you only get one of each and they cancel each other out. And once you've had one advantage and one disadvantage, you can't get another thing that gives you disadvantage and then roll with advantage, or gives you advantage. We wanted it to be where if I've got 5 things that give me an edge and 4 things that give me hitch, I want to be able to roll with an edge. And so the net result of this is that the effect of the modifiers was dampened, but the persistence of that effect, or the ability to mitigate a effect, was greatly changed. And so we started going through and we did some play testing with a group of folks. And what we found was, didn't make any difference at all in how fast the game played. Part of that was because, when we were playing with the mathematical quantifiers, or the quantified modifiers, what we ended up with was I was forgetting stuff. And so we weren't doing some of the math. It was actually faster to calculate the edge or hitch, but the end result was that all was happening was we were actually applying modifiers that had not been previously applied. And so we ended up being about the same. And we also got some feedback that the players didn't necessarily understand why they were getting edge or hitch on a given roll. Part of that is because I didn't do a great job of explaining it to them because they're all new. But part of it was that it just, there was just this kind of arbitrariness to it. And so we realized that it made it harder for people to manufacture having an edge or a hitch on their roll because there's players who are going to want to do that. And we want players to look at the environment that their character is in and find interesting ways to manipulate that environment to get benefit for their character. And so we started looking at it again. And what we ended up with was, I think, pretty elegant. We went back to quantified modifiers. We did some work to tone down the number of different sources of those modifiers. Originally, because part of the crunch of our system was that if you were walking, you could perform actions without any penalty. But if you started to jog, then you started to incur some penalties. If you were running, that penalty got worse. If you were sprinting all out, the penalty got worse still. We also had a bit of a death spiral with regards to your health, that as you got through layers or tiers of your health points, you started to have increasing penalties. And so what we did was we reduced that effect down to where you don't get any penalties until you're at the bottom 25% of your health or your spirit. And we also said that you can move up to your speed rating without any kind of penalty. And the only penalties for movement that come in are specifically when you are sprinting. And the idea being is that you're really going, and so it does make things harder to do while you're doing that. And so that went a long way to solve my problem as a game master for brand new players of carrying their water mathematically. The other thing we did was we said we don't want to walk away from edge and hitch. We feel like that is a good and interesting advantage or mechanic to incorporate in the system. And so we thought, well, okay, what do we do? Originally, the game was designed such that it was possible for your character to have to be so good at a task that it was not possible for them to fail outside of external influence. With our system, because you calculate your action roll base, your ARB in advance, basically the way that's calculated, we have a fixed, like I said, we have a fixed success threshold. So you start at 20, you subtract your talent rating, and then you subtract your related attribute. And then that tells you the number that needs to come up on the dice to achieve 20. And so based on this, it was possible to have an ARB that was a negative number. And so you were just rolling successes, which is kind of cool. But it also is like, I don't know, it delves a little too much, I think, into the power fantasy, and we don't necessarily want to go that far overboard. And so what we did was we said, okay, the worst thing you can roll on the dice should be a failure all the time. And so what's the worst thing you can roll? Well, it's not a botch, because a botch is double ones. And that we want to hold on to the fact that a botch can be successful. But something bad happens. And when you have kind of that narrative element that comes in, much like with some of the dice systems that you have in Star Wars or 3rd edition Warhammer fantasy role-playing. So we wanted to retain that. We felt like that was an important piece. So 2 or double ones can't be the worst result you can have. The worst result you can actually have is a 3, because then you're just stuck with that number. And so if you roll a 3, which is a 1 and a 1 and a 2 on the 10-sided dice, that's it. That's a failure all the time, no matter how good you are. So what this means is when we settled in on this codification of success as you have to meet or exceed your ARB on the dice roll. And your dice roll has to be at least 4. This is a little bit of a double bind here, but what it allows you to do is still have these very low ARBs because of how good your character is, without giving up the possibility of failure. And so it's not, arguably, it's not that difficult. It means that no matter how good you are, you've always got a 1% chance you're going to fail. You have a 1% chance you're going to have some kind of a botch happen. And then, because our system uses what we call success levels, those are calculated by subtracting your ARB from what you actually rolled. And so if your ARB is negative, then you're essentially rolling success levels. And so what we ended up doing was saying, okay, you're still going to calculate your success levels off of this negative number ARB, because what we didn't want to do was we didn't want to disincentivize players spending points to raise, to lower their ARB below a certain threshold, right? If you just say that if you have to roll a 4, no matter what, then there's some argument that, like, well, why would I go for an ARB of 3? That doesn't do me any good. So we said, okay, you're going to still calculate your success levels off of your actual ARB. And then the other thing that we said was, that doesn't feel like enough. If you've got an ARB that's like -5, you're literally world class at this task. And then all you get is you just get more success levels. That's kind of, eh. So what we decided was a way to retain edge and hitch in a way that was predictable and meaningful was to say that if you have an ARB that is below 4, you roll with edge. And if your ARB is above 20, you roll with a hitch. And the reason that this becomes really significant is less to do with there is a mechanical or mathematical increase in the likelihood that you'll succeed. It's very difficult to quantify because of the way that the doubles works. But what is easy to quantify and very meaningful is the impact on the probability of a botch. A botch occurs 1 out of 100 rolls, or 1% probability. If you're rolling with an edge, that drops to 0.1%. And so you end up losing 90% of the likelihood that you'll have a botch occur. That's huge. And then when you start talking about hitch, where you're dealing with ARBs that are above 20, maybe you have to spend experience points on the roll, or you're hoping to roll doubles, those kinds of things. What this represents is a task that for your character is so hard that it actually makes it more likely that some kind of a negative event is going to occur, because the probability of a botch goes from 1% to almost 3%. And so you have this almost 300 or almost tripling of the probability of a botch. And so that's kind of where we settled out. We think that is a really good way to retain the things that we came up with as far as the edge and hitch, retain the core feel, some of the elements that we really wanted to have. We weren't going to walk away from doubles. We weren't going to walk away from a botch and the way that those work. And we definitely didn't want to disincentivize any kind of, or point people in any direction with how to spend their points on their characters. So that's kind of where we sit. Right now, we're kind of going through and making sure that our rules reflect these new changes. And then once we've got that done, we're going to go in and update, provide a rules update to our Beers and Pretzels kit. That's our quick start that we have. There's a link in our bio. It's available for free on DriveThruRPG. It's 10 pre-generated characters, core rules that you need to play, a full cyberpunk dungeon crawl adventure, tokens, VTT maps, everything you need. I think there's a spreadsheet in there that's got 100 different basic NPC personality nuggets, so that if your players decide that they want to run up and talk to one of the office workers in this building, you can just roll 2d10 and figure out, okay, here's who they're talking to. And it gives you enough of a personality to be able to kind of ad-lib the response. So that's the next step. And then after that, what we run into is we're going to be releasing our rules through an SRD that will go out under Creative Commons version 4. It'll be attribution based only. And we're doing that specifically because if there are people who really like the way our rules work, and we hope that there are, we want to be able to allow you, without having to pay any money, to create your own third-party narrative setting that you can play using our mechanics. The only thing that will happen there is, again, we'll ask for attribution. And then the other thing with that is that there is going to be a little tiny nugget of narrative setting that will be released as part of the SRD that will provide a little bit of connective tissue, such that canonically any narrative setting that is created for the Altered World SRD will connect to all of the other ones. There will be this little bit of connective tissue that makes it all in kind of a shared universe. And so there's that. And doing that is a bit of a challenge simply because we're formatting it twice. One of the things that we're doing is it'll be released as a PDF document, which is great. But the other thing is that we're going to release it as an Obsidian Vault, based on a couple of different things. But one in particular, there's another YouTuber that we really like, goes by the name of Chubby Funster. He's very much a like OSR type game master, and produces some really, really astute critical thinking, critical reviews of a bunch of different adventure products. And one of the things that he's talked about in a lot of his videos is this idea of formatting for the book versus formatting for use, and that those are very different things. And what we found is that using Obsidian and its wiki-like features allows it to be much more friendly for use in play. Because if I don't remember the way a specific roll works and I'm running through the adventure and it says to make that kind of a roll, if I'm doing that through Obsidian, that roll name can be a link that I then hover my mouse over, and it will pull up a little pop-up window that tells me the mechanics of what that roll does, or if I'm looking at a power or a talent or anything like that. Those all become very easily accessible to the game master. So that's kind of where we sit. And the other big news that we have is that we recently were able to get all of the artwork from the original production version of this book upscaled to a resolution that is suitable for printing. This was a huge hurdle for us. We were looking at just an almost insurmountable price tag to be able to produce something that would be worthy of a Kickstarter reward, right? If we wanted to do a Kickstarter or crowdfunding for to have new artwork commissioned, we needed to be able to give something to the public and or to our backers. And so this allows us to be able to utilize most of, if not all of, the artwork from the original book, which was all illustrated by a guy named JP, who is just fantastic. And some of the artwork came out just amazing. The increase in quality of after upscaling it. And so we're very, very excited about that and really looking forward to where that's going to take us. I really appreciate you guys sticking around. Anybody who did, thank you very much. There are some cards that should pop up somewhere that will take you to some of our other videos about either character deep dive or some stuff about like traits may come up over here. Anyway, thank you very much for watching, and we will see you guys later. Much love to everybody. Stay safe.